So, good evening. It's great to have you all here with us. I'm Alon Confino. I'm the director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies. And welcome to the Kristallnacht Memorial Event, Jewish and Other Refugees between the 1930s and 40s and the present, in which we are going to discuss Marion Kaplan's new riveting book, Hitler's Jewish Refugees, Hope and Anxiety in Portugal, 1940 to 1945, which was published recently by Yale University Press. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that all our events are recorded and then made publicly available via our website and YouTube channel. You can find all the information on our website, and also Paz, the administrator coordinator, will send you, during the talk, will send you all the details in the chat. Also, follow us on Facebook and sign up for the mailing list if you haven't done so still. The perils of technology. I'd like to start by saying a few words about Kristallnacht. I worked on Kristallnacht some years ago for the book I wrote, The World Without Jews. And there was one event that surprised me and gave me the sense of what Kristallnacht was. And this was the burning of the Hebrew Bible. Not one copy, but thousands. And not in one place, but in hundreds of communities across the Reich. And not only in metropolis, such as Berlin, Vienna, Dresden, Stuttgart, but in small communities such as Sulzburg, a Protestant village in the state of Baden with 1,000 inhabitants, 120 of them Jewish, where the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments were thrown from the roof and the Nazis marched mockingly up and down the main street with Torah scrolls before destroying them. By fire and other means, the destruction of the Book of Books was at the center of Kristallnacht, when 1,400 synagogues were set on fire in the Reich, that is in Germany and Austria. The destruction of the Book of Books, this was something particular. Kristallnacht was an attack not simply on Jews, but on Judaism. And, we should add, also an attack on a certain kind of Christianity as well. Kristallnacht ushered a massive migration from the Reich. 70,000 Jews left Austria between Kristallnacht and September 1939. Between January 1933 and September 1939, 282,000 Jews had left Germany, and around half of them had left in 1938 and 1939. This ushered several crises. First of all, of course, the conditions, experience, and future of the refugees. There was the problem of where they will go, which countries will accept them. The problem of the Jewish refugees in the 1930s and then 40s was an international one. So this evening, we want to take the riveting story told by Marion on the Jewish refugees in Portugal as a launching pad to think about today's refugee crisis. Indeed, the epigraphs Marion uses at the beginning of each chapter are from today's refugees' history. So we want to discuss the book. It's a book event. We want to honor this book, and we want also to connect it to the refugee crisis that we have today. And for this, I'm truly honored to have with us 4 excellent scholars. Marion Kaplan is the Skirball Professor of Modern Jewish History at NYU. She is a 3-time National Jewish Book Award winner. I mean, this is, I'm sure, unique. For The Making of the Jewish Middle Class, Women, Family, and Identity in Imperial Germany, published in 1991, Between Dignity and Despair, Jewish Life in Nazi Germany, published in 1998, and Gender and Jewish History, written with Deborah Dash Moore, published in 2011, as well as a finalist for Dominican Haven, the Jewish refugees settlement in Sosua. So we are waiting for the news of her forthcoming winning again of the National Book Award. Otherwise, it's not going to be complete. Deborah Dwork is the director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at the Graduate Center at CUNY. She served as the founding director of the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University. Internationally renowned for several award-winning books, including Children with a Star and Flight from the Reich, she is also a leading authority on university education in this field. She envisioned and grew the Strassler Center into an eminent institute for doctoral training in Holocaust history and genocide studies. David Hernandez is associate professor of Latino-Latina studies at Mount Holyoke College, an interdisciplinary scholar with a doctorate in ethnic studies from UC Berkeley. His research focuses on immigration enforcement and the US detention regime. He is completing now a book entitled Alien Incarcerations, Immigrant Detention, and Lesser Citizenship, which will be published by the University of California Press. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Joel Wolf. He's a professor of Latin American history at UMass Amherst. He is the author of Working Women, Working Men, São Paulo and the Rise of Brazil's Industrial Working Class, and Authors and Progress, the Brazilian Search for Modernity. He's now at work on a book entitled The Global Twenties, Work, Life and Trade in the Western Hemisphere in the 1920s in Brazil, an Incomplete Nation. We are going to start with a short introduction by Marion Kaplan. Then we'll have our speakers. Then we'll have Marion again respond briefly so as to allow enough time for Q&A. At the bottom of your screen, you can see a Q&A tab. That's where you can write down your questions, and I will moderate the discussion when we'll arrive there. Marion, the floor is yours. Marion, you are muted.
Okay.
You're no longer muted. Oh, now you are.
How about now? Yay. Okay, let me start again. First, I want to thank Alain Confino and the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies, as well as these three panelists who've agreed to participate this afternoon. I'm very grateful to all of you. And I'm also pleased that it's in commemoration of Kristallnacht, which I'll mention again in a moment. So first, I thought I'd say, how did I come to this topic? I've been writing about the history of German Jews for many years, so that's not new. But what is new is the extremity of the refugee crisis that has had global resonance for all of us in the last decades. Today, there are 80 million forcibly displaced people around the globe. I'm also the daughter of German Jewish refugees, a fact that has imprinted itself on my life. So I began to think about these mostly Central European Jews who had struggled and managed to get out, but like most refugees today, not to their final destination. They were stuck between home and nowhere. My first book about refugees focused on those in the small settlement of Sosua in the Dominican Republic. Then I started wondering, since so many of those Sosuan Jews had transmigrated from Portugal, how did they get to Portugal? What did they do there? Importantly, how did most refugees react emotionally to the sights they encountered during their frightening odysseys and their fearful wait in an oddly peaceful purgatory? Learning from the relatively new field of the history of emotions, I thought that an emotional history of Jewish refugees fleeing their homes and histories and biding their time in Portugal could offer us a glimpse into their feelings then, and also into feelings that many refugees today may share, whether in cafes in Berlin or under tents in Jordan, no matter how widely and wildly divergent their original circumstances. Before World War II, about a third of German Jews fled Germany. Many of those seeking asylum from the Nazis went to neighboring countries, especially France and Holland, others to Palestine. After the shocking violence toward Jews during the 1938 November pogrom, also known as Kristallnacht, which we commemorate this week, German and Austrian Jews urgently tried to flee. However, immigration restrictions in foreign countries stymied many. One refugee wrote, "Every door and portal is firmly locked and bolted, and so is every heart." With the fall of France in spring 1940, millions, not only Jews, fled south. Actually, about 2/3 of Paris fled. Most foreigners, especially Jews, had to get out of France, where the police treated them with a combination of muddle and brutality, sometimes resorting to mass roundups that could end in a concentration camp. Yet leaving France proved treacherous, since the French, now cooperating with Germany, refused to grant exit visas. Spain's stance on refugees crossing borders also grew increasingly unreliable. And Portugal insisted on 30-day tourist visas to persons who could document that they already had visas to overseas destinations and could show proof of ship tickets. Many refugees didn't have these papers or money. Still, they came to Portugal, legally and illegally, with and without papers and without proper visas, sometimes expressing anguish, other times relief, often both. More specifically, my book explores how between 40,000 and 100,000 Jewish refugees reached Lisbon and what they experienced while they waited there. Many of them had already suffered social death, violence, and murder in their homelands, escaping with a few pieces of luggage or with nothing. Arriving for the most part destitute, they appreciated the kindness of Portuguese people, but feared its government and police, and wanted more than anything to find a safe haven far from Europe, in countries like the United States that were reluctant to admit them. Once in Portugal, how did refugees experience their stay? My book takes the readers on a journey to many locations which refugees confronted in their attempt to flee Europe. Geographers call these geographies of emotional life. The book focuses on a variety of such geographies, places that triggered emotional reactions and touched refugees' inner lives. Some sites could provoke panic and fear, or hope and joy, while others generated frustration, boredom, and yearning. First, the book looks at the feelings of refugees fleeing home, like one man who spoke for so many others then and today by noting, quote, "We are without rights, without a fatherland, the burdensome foreigners whom one arrests. We are really nothing but sand strewn by the winds of history." Then the book highlights the borders refugees tensely crossed as they feared guards would turn them back. Next, it focuses on the lines at consulates and welfare organizations that refugees fretfully waited on in order to beg strangers for help, and also looks at the smoky cafes they uneasily inhabited with nothing but a cup of coffee and endless time on their hands. And finally, the dangerously overcrowded transatlantic ships that signaled their liberation, but also their loss of a homeland. So life in limbo, a key moment in most refugees' experiences, had at its core anxiety and fear. But also, I found courage and resilience. Most refugees in Portugal showed strength and stamina as they faced unimagined challenges. For them, Lisbon emerged as a site of temporality and transition, a kind of no man's land between a painful past and a hopeful future. And I think I'll leave it at there and turn to my colleagues.
Shai, with pleasure. Thank you, Marion. Thank you so much for framing the conversation this evening. Marion's book, Hitler's Jewish Refugees, tells an intimate history of Jewish refugees in Portugal. In her book, as she explained, she traces refugees' journeys to Portugal, and she recounts their lives as lived each day. Lasering in on emotions, she adds a key yet previously utterly overlooked dimension. This perspective allows her and allows us, her readers, to interpret the refugee experience through a new lens. It breaks open the conceptualization of refugees held by historians such as Abraham Milgram. In his otherwise masterful study of Portugal, Salazar, and the Jewish refugees, Abraham Milgram writes that the refugees led, quote, totally ordinary lives, Marion observes. And she goes on to ask the obvious question, here my words, not hers, what is ordinary about being a refugee? And now Marion's words, refugees experience their lives as precisely the opposite of, quote, ordinary. They experienced the abnormal as routine, even depressingly boring, but never ordinary. Formerly citizens with rights, stable lives, family networks, and friends, they faced previously unimaginable losses, personal, political, economic, and social. Marion engages with how the refugees felt, in addition to what they did, to allow her readers to grasp what they experienced, and thus perhaps to have greater empathy for and imagination about refugees today. This is not simply some pious hope. Underscoring that aim, she starts each chapter with an epigraph, quoting a present-day refugee. She does not specify who is speaking, nor are the quotations footnoted. And initially, the reader assumes Marion pulled the words from an oral history. Flipping to the notes section, one stands corrected. The epigraphs come from Syrian refugees in our time, not Jewish refugees in the 1940s. The echoes between past and present reverberate. Marion's message is clear. As Faulkner said, the past is never dead. It isn't even past. To which I add, the past matters. Our scholarship about the past matters. And in this case, it can help readers understand unfolding news reports, whether about Syrian refugees or asylum seekers on our southern border. Marion depicts the refugees' exterior as well as interior daily lives. Her detailed discussion of everyday life contextualizes the refugees' psychological state. This shines particularly brightly in her discussion of spaces, specific locales. Drawing upon recent work in historical and social geography, she casts a keen eye on ordinary refugee microenvironments. Standing online, as she mentioned, for example, we know the Jews of Greater Germany queued at embassies, consulates, shipping companies, and government offices, desperate for papers, exit visas, transit visas, receipts for tax payments, clearance forms, ship tickets, train tickets. And as I learned recording oral histories for my book, Flight from the Reich, this led to an unanticipated way for young people to make money. We kids did this work of queuing up, Bobby Rosner, then 13 years old, recalled. One had to start at 8 in the morning, and one had to queue up until 11 or 12. So an adult would say, "Would you queue for me?" Sometimes they had to get a form, and then I could get it for them. But when it came to doing serious business, the adult had to be there. So standing in lines was a known factor. What no one had explored, and Marion analyzes, is how refugees experienced those lines. At home in Greater Germany, on the road in Marseille, and in their city of refuge, Lisbon. She zeroes in on the meaning for refugees of those queues. And I quote, "They had spent frustrating days in their homelands lining up for necessary papers, and many had stood on similar lines in Marseille, and then again at 4 border crossings before making it to Portugal. Now in Lisbon, they once again endured lines at consulates. Uncertainty magnified the stress of waiting." If lines were a specific geographical locus of anxiety, cafes were a site of solace. Portugal's ubiquitous cafes, Marion explains, played an essential role in most refugees' lives, offering an opportunity to meet others who struggled with the same hopes and fears. Cafes, she observes, offered a semblance of normalcy. One refugee called the cafe the only place where I could feel at all as if I belonged. Cafes had a practical function as well. They served as crucial hubs of information. Thanks to the occasional advance notice that swept through Lisbon's cafes, Jewish refugees in that city sometimes managed to dodge police checks. Then, too, as newspapers and letters were censored, cafe rumors, the so-called refugee telegraph, was deemed more reliable, or in any case more fruitful in alerting refugees in a timely manner about, for example, which shipping agencies had tickets to sell. Cafes served as sites of chance meetings between friends and family separated by the war and state-run persecution. And they were places where strangers might meet, chance encounters that might yield practical advantages or emotional connection. Historians may have long known that refugees spent time, a lot of time, in cafes. Marion's close analysis lays bare the multiple practical, social, and emotional functions of these sites. Her focus on places, physical locations, helps us, the readers, understand both the constantly shifting nature of the refugee existence and staples specific to it. Thus, for example, she points out that fleeing the Germans, refugees flooded small French towns, places they may have enjoyed in better times. Now, these towns offered little relief, where to find a bed, where to find food. The axis of their lives had tilted. The pleasant vacation site was now a wretched stopover. Marion's elaboration of forced residence, a consistent feature of the refugee experience across countries and continents, puts meat and muscle on that simple two-word phrase, forced residence. Faced with masses of newcomers in Lisbon who were overstaying their 30-day transit visas, the Portuguese government forced refugees to live in designated villages and towns. This spatial entrapment, even in pretty seaside towns, caused intense apprehension, Marion explains. Living in a fixed residence made it harder to get to a consulate. Not acquiring proper visas from a consulate made it harder to leave Portugal. Drilling down on the refugee experience of specific sites once again opens our understanding of the challenges the asylum seekers faced. In the final few minutes that I hold the floor, I turn to intersections between Marion's work and the book I am writing now. Saints and Liars tells the story of a number of Americans who traveled to points around the globe to offer relief and rescue victims of Nazi Germany and other racist states. The narrative arcs from one rescue activity hotspot to another. As one place became too dangerous and the operative's scope dwindled, another location emerged. And thus, like Marion, I came to Lisbon. As I worked on refugee history, first in Flight from the Reich from the perspective of the Jews who fled, and now in Saints and Liars, focusing on relief and rescue operatives, I began to pay attention to the slippery, unquantifiable factors of luck, chance, and timing. Over and over again, escape openings turned on these unpredictable elements. The fortuitous circumstance of rain when running for one's life across an open field because it prevented guard dogs from picking up the fugitive scent, impeded the sentry's view, and muffled the noise of crashing through a meadow. The timing of slipping across a frontier during the interval of the guards' rounds. The chance that on that particular night, the schedule would have changed. In Saints and Liars, I tackle the even messier role of the irrational, human relations, sympathies, antipathies, drives, desires. In short, in the history I study and the history I tell, the unpredictable and the irrational emerge as key factors. Pondering this, I realized that while we social historians have traditionally focused on the role and function of social class, occupation, religion, race, age, and gender, we have shied away from the unpredictable and irrational. We don't know what to do with those factors, and so we just don't do much. Yet these variables loom large in daily lived life. And thus I come back to your book, Marion. Reading Hitler's Jewish refugees, I was struck by the role and function of the unpredictable and the irrational in the protagonists' lives. Luck, timing, fortuitous circumstances, human sympathies and antipathies, all of these emerge in the histories you tell. And I wonder if you might speak to that. Thank you. Thank you for writing this book. And thank you to the organizers for offering me this wonderful opportunity to comment upon it.
I guess I'll begin. Is that right, Alon? Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank Alon for inviting me to comment. And I also want to thank Marion Kaplan for writing such a terrific book. It's well-researched and conceptualized, and it's beautifully written. I truly learned a great deal from it. As Alon mentioned at the beginning, I'm a historian of modern Latin America, and I don't work on refugees or ethnicity, and this book is certainly not in one of my research areas. So I'm just going to discuss those parts of the book that I, as a teacher of modern Latin American history, and also as a historian who happens to be Jewish, found particularly interesting. I was at first intrigued by the whole notion of Holocaust geography, and this may be a very well-known idea among people who study the Holocaust, but it was new to me. And it really made me think about the actual process of movement in the creation and reconstitution of diasporic communities. And I think that's a really important idea that is just so beautifully dealt with by the book. I was also interested, but not particularly surprised by the fact that Jewish refugees primarily wanted to go to the United States. They wanted to get out of Europe, but they were perfectly willing to go to Latin America, and their desperation led them to really take any place in Latin America. And I am a historian of Brazil, and Brazil at this time was a deeply problematic place for Jews. The dictator had come to power on the back of a fake conspiracy called the Cohen Plan that he said was going to overthrow the government. So there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the military and in the government. But Jews in Portugal didn't care. They just wanted to get out of Europe. And that, of course, makes a lot of sense. But I was most interested by some of the findings in chapter 4 of the book, especially on the different experiences in Portugal of parents and children. And I thought this was just so beautifully done in the book. Kaplan demonstrates how spatial identity and what she calls emotional citizenship were really issues for adults. The sense of being uprooted affected men and women differently, and she details that quite well. But both were devastated at the loss of everything from their professions to the possessions that they had. And the sense of being rejected by their home countries, particularly given the construction of modern German nationalism, I think, is something that was just emotionally devastating. And she ends the beginning of this chapter, maybe the first third or half of this chapter, with a section about adults who were dispossessed from these things and from their lives, experiencing a rising incidence of suicide, or at least the perception in the community that there were rising numbers of suicides, and not only in Portugal, but also in the Americas when they had moved. And right after that section, there's a fabulous juxtaposition, and that is her analysis of the children in these communities. And I think she does that because there's this kind of moment of great despair followed by an analysis of kind of hopefulness. And what's wonderful about this is that, I mean, there are children who know how hard it is for their parents, and she notes their children who become caregivers for their parents. But it's a really lovely example of how what she does in the book is she takes us to the everyday existence, and sometimes the happy existence, right, of people living through a catastrophe. And I mean, here we are on Zoom. I mean, we're living through a catastrophe, and yet we're living our lives. And it's always hard sometimes for historians when we think about, the Holocaust. I mean, obviously, nothing is more serious than that. A war, a revolution, a world health crisis. To remember that people still sometimes fall in love and sometimes fall out of love and can laugh and have lives. And by focusing on the children, she does that, and she does that really, really well. What she shows is that a majority of the children and teenagers enjoyed their new lives in Portugal. And one of the reasons, and there's a section called Accepting New Possibilities, Young Refugees Look Forward. And one of the reasons this is kind of obvious as soon as you think about it is that as things get really bad in Germany, their lives are shrinking, right? I mean, and she goes through this, that they're losing access to their friends, they're losing access to schools, that the Nazi restrictions on Jews are very much hurting them. And so arriving in Portugal means that they now have new friends, Portuguese friends, Jewish friends. They're in a new place. There's a freedom there that was exciting. They hadn't lost as much as their parents had. And they didn't have their parents' responsibilities. I mean, one thing this book is very good about is showing like the extraordinary daily work that refugees did trying to get out of Portugal. Well, the children didn't go through that. They had new communities and bonds of friendship, and they were often blissfully unaware of their parents' despair. Teenage girls probably even had more freedom in Portugal to have a dating life than they might have had in Germany. So this is a lovely and hopeful part of the book. And Kaplan uses a lot of oral histories with people who, were teenagers in 1940 and, are elderly people when they're doing these histories. And they admit, looking back, that they did have a good time and they weren't really paying as much attention to the horror of what this was. And I am particularly fascinated by this because I am a historian of modern Latin America. And, there was a real flowering of refugee communities from Latin America because there were a series of military dictatorships in the 1960s and 70s into the 1980s in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay. And significant numbers of people fled, some went to other Latin American countries, but most went to the United States and to Western Europe. And there were really important generational divides there. And I can talk about this intellectually, but some of this I just know personally as someone who's connected to the Jewish community in Sao Paulo, that many people my age who were teenagers growing up in Brookline, Massachusetts, or Berkeley, California, or in London or Paris, they grew up in a world where the kind of overt sexism that's obvious in Brazilian society is not expressed as overtly. And women were very uncomfortable going back to Brazil. And a lot of children were very angry with their parents for continuing to embrace this homeland that had rejected them. There's a terrific Franco-Argentine movie called Tangos, The Exile of Gardel, which captures this generational divide by looking at the Argentine exile community in Paris and how parents are completely committed to tango clubs, because at these clubs they're with other Argentines and they're doing the most Argentine thing you can do, dancing the tango, and their children are French identified and want nothing to do with this old-fashioned dance from a country that they disdain. Now, it's not the same thing, but I think looking at this generational divide and these cleavages is really important. And I think the most obvious and important example for us today are the so-called DACA children. And it's really funny that we call them DACA children because DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. But the acronym has kind of entered our minds in a broader sense that we now use it to say things like DACA children. And these are about people who kind of feel and look like citizens, but aren't technically citizens because they were brought here by their parents, without them really knowing about it because they were small children, largely from Latin America, and they had no say in the matter. But while DACA recipients are obviously the product of a politics that's very, very different from the Holocaust, the fact of their lives as adults, adults who were child refugees, is ultimately connected to the experience of these Jewish children in Portugal, right? That they were blissfully unaware of what was going on in Guatemala or Honduras that brought their parents to escape that violence and despair. And so ultimately the experiences of these young people, whether we're talking about the United States or in France or in Portugal in the 1930s and 40s, represent a kind of hopeful story about adaptability and community. And the younger Jews in Portugal who Marion Kaplan studies are one of the happier parts of this moving and wonderful book. And I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for, great to hear everyone's comments. Thank you for the opportunity to read Professor Kaplan's riveting and at times harrowing book, Hitler's Jewish Refugees. Okay. I'm pleased that the story of refugees fleeing genocide is part of the annual Kristallnacht memorial event, highlighting, as Kaplan suggests, the range and reach of the Holocaust, even for those who escaped. Kaplan writes of her subjects, formerly citizens with rights, stable lives, family networks, and friends, they had faced previously unimaginable losses, personal, political, economic, and social. This description of Jewish refugees fits my research subjects as well. Largely immigrants from Latin America who represent almost wholly the entire focus of the United States detention and deportation regime. As such, I would like to speak to the book in relation to my own work on US immigration enforcement policy, where I see critical and instructive parallels, historical and contemporary, to the brutal and definitional treatment of Jewish refugees in Europe. The emotional terrain in Kaplan's book, or what she describes as an emotional history of fleeing, reveals a great deal about contemporary asylum seeking, broken into stages, located at multiple borders, reliant on the reception of a reluctant host society, and engaged with a variety of multinational, institutional, and bureaucratic forces. Even survival, after one was safe, seemed fragile. As Germany began to lose the war, Jewish refugees remained fearful and further susceptible to bad luck or timing. It's sort of like when a tyrant loses an election and will not concede and has 70 days of authority remaining. It causes survivors to feel anxiety and the powerful to flail. I thought Kaplan demonstrated a beautiful and frightening use of the archive to make the history of refugee existence come alive. I have to admit that it sometimes put me on the edge of my seat and turned my stomach, while at other times made me nostalgic for a courageous and welcoming Lisbon that I have never visited. One of the painful reminders in Kaplan's scholarship, which is probably no surprise for experts of the Holocaust, is that for every story of survival and resilience, and there are so many here, there are untold stories of state violence and tragedy, of mishaps, fluctuations in luck, almost always at the hands of cruel bureaucracies and individual power brokers, border guards, police, suspicious neighbors. There are similar ghost stories in the US context, often in the shape of bodies that turn up in the desert or wash ashore in the US Southwest, or the half-told stories of loved ones migrating north, never to be seen again. As such, those that did not escape weigh heavily in this study. As with the US context, refugees and asylum seekers rarely get to exist as Kaplan so richly describes. Migrants are rarely viewed as full and complex persons. They often do not have names or faces, but instead they are stereotypes and punching bags for politicians, for charlatans, for soon-to-be former presidents. The upside is that they survive too, and their stories are dying to be told, and Kaplan has provided a powerful template here. Okay. I want to share some crucial parallels to my work that Kaplan brings to the forefront in this study. I have arranged them in three broad and imperfect categories. They are the catch-22, reluctant hosts, and then bureaucratic cruelty. So first, the catch-22. Kaplan provides numerous examples of catch-22s, or impossible choices. One is the pairing of the exit visa for one country with the entry visa for the other. Refugees could have one and not the other, or be expelled from one country but not allowed to enter the next one. There was the difficulty of gaining a US visa from Lisbon when sequestered in the fixed residences by Portuguese authorities, placing them out of reach of the consulate as their temporary papers expired. There were the unbearable choices, according to Kaplan, of sending children abroad unaccompanied as exile bore down on child development and fear of German invasion forced such harsh choices. And US and British policies also facilitated such family separation in the years prior to and during World War II. Today, Central American parents make similar choices, sending their children north to the US and away from danger at home, alone. In the mid-20th century, Mexican workers also faced the catch-22, hoping to migrate north. They needed proof of employment in the US to formally exit Mexico. But in the US, a private labor contract with a migrant was unlawful, preventing entry. The catch-22 thus prompted unlawful migration. In a parallel way, the breaking of laws of becoming quote unquote illegal in the 1940s European context entailed a heartbreaking social descent for refugees, according to Kaplan. German about-faces and Jewish policy added to the confusion. The Germans themselves initially ordered Jews to leave, but at their own expense. In a short time span, the self-deportation became a forced removal. and then later a prevention of emigration, and then the deadly movement of Jews back to occupied territories and into concentration camps. 2. Reluctant hosts. António de Oliveira Salazar's ambiguous stance toward Jewish refugees, perhaps brought on by important Jewish friendships, led to fragile, if not haphazard, policies, making the nation a reluctant host and sending mixed messages, writes Kaplan. I was surprised to see the Lisbon Cafe as the site of such cultural tensions. In Kaplan's book, flight is experienced individually, as a family, and as a collective racial group. I appreciate Kaplan's exploration of gender's role in migration and violence, gendered familial roles in flight, and in temporary settlement in Portugal, all bringing about divergent falls from grace as men or women, as mothers or fathers. Portuguese cafe culture would become a cultural battleground among the people of Portugal and the refugees, eased only by the relatively short duration of refugees' length of stay. Mexico, too, as a transmigratory nation for the last 50 years, has become a reluctant host to Latin Americans passing through the United States. Over the last half decade, Mexico has deported more Central Americans than the United States. Its current president has been deepening his relationship to the Trump administration while resisting some, but not all, calls for cooperation. As in Portugal, Mexican secular and faith-based organizations provide lifelines to refugees, and everyday residents provide water, food, and shelter despite their own poverty. I can't think of a better comparison to 2020 Mexico than 1940s Portugal. The United States, too, in normal times, used to reflect such reluctance, where bureaucracies on one side of the hallway sought to punish migrants and on the other side sought to provide relief. This is the traditional contradiction of US asylum policy, even despite its Cold War moorings, where refugee and asylum law provided support, a legal process, and potential safety, even under harsh anti-immigrant administrations, both Democrat and Republican. Sadly, Donald Trump has crushed that contradiction, aligning the White House and his cabinet offices to smother the asylum system, disregard international commitments, and treat immigrant children as political currency. Kaplan's book is replete with examples of bureaucratic cruelty, being stranded in offices and consulates, intense amounts of paperwork, entry, exit, and transit visas, and other hurdles. As Kaplan writes, then and now, refugees learn that documents mattered, end quote. This is what some have called death by 1,000 paper cuts. Such administrative technologies, the passport, the photograph, the visa, fingerprints, all accompanied by fees, are 20th century border walls. Kaplan provides endless stories of endless lines, time-consuming and anxiety-provoking. She writes, uncertainty magnified the stress of waiting. As the US-Mexico border, the Trump administration, uncertainty magnified the stress of waiting. At the US-Mexico border, the Trump administration has weaponized the line, introducing metering or permitting only a few people to pass the border per day, despite the capacity to manage much more. The system, a deliberate slowdown, has forced migrants to line up earlier and earlier, and eventually to create their own informal list, their own system for waiting in line. Being stranded in Mexico is now the norm, as the US's Remain in Mexico policy prevents entry even during asylum proceedings. And then with COVID-19, the Surgeon General has virtually closed the border to almost all entry, facilitating expedited deportations. Survival is perplexing in Kaplan's book, with refugees fleeing a rapidly changing German society, then invading armies, and then collapsing nations. Borders could close at any minute while genocide was, quote, on the move. Some refugees would learn later that their escape and survival was due to sheer luck. I've drawn these parallels between US enforcement policy and Kaplan's study to demonstrate but a few examples of the importance and scale of this crucial project. While today's crisis at the US-Mexico border is not a deliberate racial genocide, it is steeped in systematic racism and a deep history of xenophobia. In Kaplan's period of study, the United States had various mechanisms to slow migration. National quotas, health categories such as poor physique or stature often applied to Jewish migrants, various forms of refugee fatigue, or purported fears of a fifth column emerging amongst refugees. After the war, early refugee law became hijacked by Cold War imperatives, slowing the arrival of Jewish migrants from Europe. Refugee policy would later discern between economic and political refugees, supporting refugees fleeing communism, but deeming all others mere economic migrants. These policies, including the generalized adversarial stance toward migrants in need, created a bottleneck in Lisbon, as Marion carefully described. Such policies also prevent humanitarian relief today for our neighbors. Thank you, Marion, for your book. It is such a tremendous contribution.
Can I thank everybody? Can you hear me? Can I thank everybody for your amazing comments? I've been taking notes the whole time so that I could think about it also later. I appreciate the deep reading you've all done and the comparisons you've made. So thank you very, very much. Alon, you wanted to lead this, or do you want me to say a few more words?
Would you like to say a few words to answer, or we can start?
Yeah, no, I could say a few things. In fact, David said something that I wanted to mention when Deborah asked or raised the issue of unpredictability. So you have these harried, harassed Jews running into Lisbon, and who would have guessed that one of Salazar's best friends was the head of the Jewish community? That was an amazing and unpredictable moment. And it made a huge difference because Salazar was really, he was not a racist. He wrote essays against Hitler's racism. So he thought racism was stupid, but he also was very worried about foreigners who might be left-leaning or communist, which could be another code word for Jews. And yet Amzalek, who was the head of the Jewish community for 50 years, was one of his best friends, possibly his best friend. He didn't have many friends. So I think that was a very unpredictable and very fortuitous coincidence. There are many other unpredictable moments. I'm thinking of all the times people crossed the Pyrenees and waiting, as you said, waiting for the change of the guards or finding a place where they knew there were no guards. And when there were dogs, it was much harder because they could be found, but often they knew there were no dogs tonight, or they'd find out from smugglers. And I always try to give smugglers a good name, because in the United States, we always think they're terrible people, but in fact, they saved lives. And they were very important. And Jews who write in their memoirs are not ashamed to say we were smuggled, or my mother gave her ring so that we could be smuggled. I mean, that was just the best way to go about it. And so I thought that was important. There was, the generational differences, I think, came just jumping at me, so that if it was a young person who was now writing their memoirs, or even like a Raoul Hilberg, who was only 8 years old, I think at the time, Peter Gay, who was also like 11 years old, 12 years old, they would say, this was the world opening up to me, whereas their parents were freaking out. Or one man who read his father's memoirs decades later and realized as a kid, he had had a great time at the border. He was running around in freedom. He hadn't been able to run around at home in Germany at all. And his father was desperately trying to get his grandmother into Portugal at the same time and was terrified. So I think there were these very, very stark generational differences. And I was very glad to be able to say something positive. It's something that was somewhat hopeful. and David, there's so many parallels. It's really, the two I want to pick out are the Portuguese were incredibly poor people, and they were so generous. I mean, I had to look at social psychology to try to understand these people who didn't have shoes would bring fruit and would not take money as Jews came across the border. They were really amazingly generous. And the other part of that is the US issue with Trojan horses, with people, and with the Trojan horses that were actually mentioned even by Franklin Roosevelt. Well, in his debate with Hillary Clinton, one of the first debates, Trump uses the term Trojan horses twice. I even wrote an op-ed for the Forward about that, because it was so absurd that these mothers and children at the Mexican border were Trojan horses. But he, hammered it home, and it became an issue. And in America also, Breckinridge Long, who was the Undersecretary of State at the time, he slowed the workings. He said, delay and delay and delay. If anybody's watching this and interested in you can just Google Breckinridge Long, and that comes up right away. How he tried to delay the paperwork necessary to bring refugees in a timely way. They were not brought in a timely way. And the new book by David Nassau, The Last Million, is about how until 1951-53, there's still 1 million people that aren't being absorbed. So I think those are the few things I want to say, but they were such rich comments. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you, Deborah, Joel, and David. These were really great papers. So I have a question from the audience, and I have two questions also. I'll ask Marion by way of asking all of you if anyone has things to say. So Michelle Toussaint is asking about the gender component, the gender experience of being a refugee. Do you see a difference in how women, single, married, young, and old, experience life in Portugal? Do they see themselves as refugees? And how do they refer to their status? And I have two questions. So one is about emotions. If you can tell us a little bit about how did you go about finding emotions in the sources, writing about them, putting them in conversation, perhaps which books, perhaps literature helped you understand emotions. And the other question that certainly others can also address is the issue of the language and translation. I guess the sources came in different languages, obviously. So whether there were, or how did you address the fact that different people talk different languages, which then were translated by officials or by the refugees or by others into other languages? Whether this was something that you encountered and you thought it is an interesting problem to address, whether the refugees addressed the issue of language and the translation?
Well, I think actually the first gender question, I can answer part of that. I think Deborah has, with her Saints and Liars, has some gender issues she could describe. And David also, there's so many gender issues at the border. So let me start off by saying I wrote a whole book on a gender analysis of Jewish life in Germany during the Nazi period, called Between Dignity and Despair, Jewish Life in Germany. And it's a lot of Nazi Germany. It's a lot about the gendered differences, the gender difference, the reimagining of gender roles during the Nazi period, which were quite extreme in the Nazi era, because German Jewish men were really endangered going out on the streets, going to the police, going to the to bureaucracies. So women did a lot. Men lost their jobs. Women picked up on some of the work that needed to be done to earn a living, etc. As refugees, those gender distinctions narrowed. They're both on the road. He's not earning any money. She's not earning any money. They both have two good heads. They have to think about how they're going to do this. They may have children with them. So the gender differences really pale. When they get to Portugal, there are not as many gender differences because they're all standing on line. He's standing on one line, she may be standing at a different consulate on a different line, but they're all sharing the work. When they are in the forced residences, you see women gathering. Women gather and knit or read or do something or make little play groups for children, and the men get depressed. So that's what I saw where there's a gender difference was within the forced residences. Not so surprising. There's a wonderful Austrian sociology book about, I think it's Marienthal, by an Austrian sociologist, where they go to small villages during the Great Depression and they find the same thing, that women are trying to do things. They just need to be together and to make things happen, and the men sit around and sometimes play checkers or chess and sometimes are just depressed. So I think that there are very interesting gender dimensions there. In terms of emotions, well, two things. There's a whole school of the history of emotions now, and I've been reading a lot of that material, especially literature that's come out of the Institute for the History of Emotions at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin. And it's in English, it's in German, it's in other languages too. It's very, very interesting material. And that gets me back, I forgot, Jody, one other thing was there is a whole history now of geographies of the Holocaust. I mean, if you just Google it, you'll find some books. One of the authors that comes to my mind is Tim Coles, who writes about different stages of the geography of the locations. But anyway, so I was very impressed by this history of emotions literature. And there's way too many. I mean, you just go on the bibliography. It goes on for, hundreds of books. So I think that I didn't want to write the same book about Lisbon as I had written about Sosua, which was just the government and the refugees. I wanted to look at the history of emotions. And this is not a history of emotions. This is, as I said, an emotional history of refugees. It's really not a history of emotions as such. I was focused on the refugees, but I was very curious. And then you asked, how did I find it? It's all over the place. People talk about their feelings. Even in interviews some years later, they talk about their feelings. And in the old interviews from the 1940s or memoirs, they talk about feelings. Feelings are all over the place. It's just that historians have ignored it. So to that extent, I think it was very easy. In terms of language, I didn't approach that very much, except for the German word Angst, because Angst can mean so many different things. So I was really interested in language when it came to how people express that. But most of my sources were in German and English and some French. The Portuguese sources were not about emotions. They were usually the government, government letters to each other. So the Portuguese material was not about emotions at all. But the memoirs and the interviews and letters. I have one letter, it's so in your face, it's just that we wouldn't have noticed it before, where a man says, I've been on this line forever. Finally, I got into the consulate, the American consulate, and I stood there and my knees trembled. And he writes that to his mother in America. Well, I mean, that tells us something, right? We don't have to imagine. We can understand if his knees are trembling, he's terribly anxious. So it was all over the place, I would say. But I'm curious about saints and liars, and I'm also curious about emotions at the border.
Deborah, David, would you like to say something about this, or you'll pass?
I could say something just about to add to Marion's explanation of the gendered question. I think as she demonstrates is that, you know, the refugee process created certain gendered opportunities for some and then kind of demotions for others because of the pressure on the family and the pressure on relationships and marriages, et cetera. I think what's interesting is it's not here, but in the Latin American context, when migrants move in pieces, like a husband leaves and a wife might leave 10 years later, that kind of thing, there's also those effects, but it's transnational, that those sort of opportunities and new responsibilities might be in the home country while the husband is abroad. And suddenly the spouse has all these new responsibilities and interesting, you know, she becomes the father as well, the husband as well as the mother, you know, so there's these transnational shifts as well. With refugees, they usually leave altogether, so it's different. But as well as Marion mentioned in her answer, is that, you know, gender violence itself is a form of displacement, you know, for migrants, and that's why they leave. You know, oftentimes fleeing the home, you know, their homes and their spouses, and then even just the ability to choose to leave is highly gendered in terms of access to funds and the social networks it takes to migrate. And then finally, the conditions of migration, you know, women are targeted in a particular way, just like children are targeted in a particular way, just like men are targeted in a particular way. So gender is, it's so powerful, such a powerful lens into the whole process. And so, but I think that's why I found the cafe example so enriching, how you had these different cultural gendered schemes of behavior that were in play and interesting, you know, and so I'll stop there.
And I have a much more cheerful perspective on this question. I'm working on American relief and rescue operatives. So social work was a traditionally female occupation, but this kind of social work, international as opposed to local, that was new. And the women loved it. They were serious about their work. They they were people of improbable courage. They took all kinds of risks, but they loved the freedom, the ability to use far more of their brains, of being able to deploy all kinds of unorthodox solutions to problems, to doing clandestine work. They loved it. So if I only talked about that, it would sound only like an adventure tale. And I want to be very clear, it wasn't only an adventure tale. They were serious about their work. Their work was transformative. It transformed the lives of the people they managed to help, and it transformed them as well.
Thank you. So Ellie Costello asks, David Hernandez mentioned the faith-based lifeline that provide aid for Latin American refugees in Mexico. To what extent were Jewish refugees able to seek out similar help from Jewish communities in Catholic Portugal and other Latin American destinations in the 1930s and 40s? I'd like to ask a few more questions. Patricia Martinho Ferrero mentions that the Portuguese World Exhibition was held in Lisbon in 1940. So while doing your research on this book, Marion, did you find any material where Portuguese colonial empire is mentioned or discussed in any ways relating to this issue of the Jewish refugees? And Karen Ramler asked, to what extent were you able to draw from transgenerational memories of the descendants of the German Jews who ended up staying in Portugal?
All right, let me start with Jewish aid organizations. And again, I think Deborah will have something to say about that. The only way that these close to 80,000 to 100,000 people could have survived was because there were Jewish aid organizations and non-Jewish aid organizations that helped them. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee had its biggest office was in Geneva, and its second biggest office, I think, was Lisbon. And they were a lifeline. They supported Jews who needed shelter, who needed meals. They got a small allowance every day. They set up a huge free lunch soup kitchen where people were they made 500 meals a day, where people would trek up the hills to the soup kitchen. So the joint was absolutely crucial. And then the joint supported something called HIAS, which was the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and HISAM. There are all these different alphabet letters that were Jewish organizations that were helping people to get out or to survive while they were there. The Quakers were there, the Unitarians were there, the Red Cross was there. The joint mostly took care of Jews, but the Quakers took care of Jews and the Unitarians took care of Jews too, who had become Christian. So they kind of divided it that way. And the joint sometimes supported the Quakers in helping those people, but they couldn't help them as Christians. So there was that kind of faith-based aid situation. Portuguese colonial empire, well, two things to say. First, that big 1940 Portuguese, like World's Fair kind of, but it was just a Portuguese fair. What's interesting about that is I've seen photos in the archives of dozens of buses in the main square of Lisbon taking thousands of people to a little bit out of town to where the fair took place. Jewish refugees never mention it. They don't seem to have gone to the fair. And one of them wrote, "Why would I go to the fair? I just was trying to get through my day." So it was more or less like the fair was for the Portuguese. It was really for Salazar. It was a show off for Salazar fair. So there was really very little about colonialism. The other thing I can say is that there were Jews who were interested in going to the Portuguese colonies. Salazar didn't want them in Portugal, but he accepted them and he was trying to push them out. He absolutely refused for them to go to the colonies. So that's all I know, that there were some attempts and he absolutely refused. And that, if I were to figure out why, I think that's because he thought the Jews might be revolutionaries or might cause disturbances there. And there were even some letters in the archives where one of the governors of one of the colonies, I'm forgetting which one now, said, you know, these people have money, they'll set up a store, it'll be a good tourist industry. And Salazar said, no Jews in the colonies. So that's what I know about the colonial empire. And then German Jews staying. There's some very nice, well, they're not memoirs. I have some memoirs, I have some interviews of German Jews who stayed. And there are two very nice films about German Jews who stayed, one by Daniel Blaufuchs. And then there are some novels by Ilse Loza. One of them is called, I think, Under Strange Skies, something like that. She was a German Jewish woman who came there, married a Portuguese, brought up Portuguese children, and wrote 3 novels, kind of homesick. Well, homesick for her Heimat. She said, you know, the beautiful beaches in Portugal, I love the beautiful beaches, but I miss my forests and mountains. So she was one of the people that I use in one of my chapters to talk about Heimat and how they missed the homeland, not the people, not the Germans, but the land that they come from. So there weren't many German Jews who stayed, but there were a good number, maybe under 100. And you can see them in these films. This is Karen Remler's question. Hello, Karen. I can send you the films because I don't remember them now, the names.
David, you wanted to say maybe something before, and I didn't see it. No. No. Yeah, Joel.
I did. I just wanted to mention that Marion said something about Salazar not being racist because of his view of Jews, and I understand the perspective she's coming from. But as a Brazilianist, what I would say is that Salazar was actually deeply racist, obviously, with regard to Mozambique and Angola.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I know you know that. But what I'm saying is that maybe that colors how he looks at Jews, right? That he sees Jews as white and modern because his whole kind of notion of people who are less than are Africans, right? And so that might be part of the way he understands Jews as white. Right?
Absolutely. In fact, he wrote an essay against race, against Hitler's notion of race, which I think I said he thought was stupid. But definitely, I didn't mean to say he was not a racist at all, but against Jews, it seemed to be a strangely positive aspect. And I think you're right, it was about modernization as well. But also Brazil, I'm curious because when I was studying whether Jews could get into Brazil or not, I came across Judith Lakin's book, I think, which describes that resident Jews in Brazil were considered not Black, but refugee Jews were considered, whether Black or whatever color, they were not welcome. And so I was curious. To me, that was one of the most irrational ideas, that Jews here are okay and Jews there are not okay.
Yeah, I don't know the exact reason for that, although I do study this period. What I can tell you is that the regime was fairly anti-Semitic, but that Brazilians for years, and this is true of Argentines as well, really wanted white immigrants. I mean, and in fact, so much so that Brazilians code Japanese as the white Asians. The majority of Japanese living outside Japan live in Brazil. But then they had this really weird stuff where, of course, the best white people were Nordic people, right? And then the lesser white people were actually Spanish, right? Because of the Moorish presence, right? So that diminished Spanish. I mean, it's really nutty stuff, right? But they believed this in the 19th century. And I think that the Brazilian military, which is very influential in the regime at this time, is filled with pro-Nazi anti-Semites which is ironic because Brazil sends troops to fight in Europe under the US command. But there's a real kind of balancing act there. And the best work on Jews in Brazil is actually by Jeff Lesser down at Emory.
Yeah,
and yeah, I know you must know. And Jeff's kind of argument is that while Brazilians venerate being a multi-ethnic society, that if you're an immigrant from certain areas, you're Brazilian. But if you're Middle Eastern, then you're the Syro-Lebanese Brazilian. If you're Jewish, you're Jewish Brazilian. If you're Japanese, you're Japanese Brazilian. And he calls them the hyphenated people. And so that the Jews occupy the hyphenated space, whereas Italian Brazilians, Italian heritage Brazilians, and Spanish heritage Brazilians, they're just Brazilian. So it's a kind of a complicated dance. But there was a lot of that. One other thing I want to add is the 1924 immigration law, which you referenced in talking about American attitudes, has a little piece in it that a lot of people don't realize, which is there are no restrictions on any immigrants from the Western Hemisphere, French, Canadians, Mexicans, anyone. And I always wondered if American policymakers kind of worried about Jews going to Latin America, and then from Latin America having free entry to the United States. And I just don't know if that was part of their thinking, because it was, law for, 16 years by 1940 that anyone in the Dominican Republic could simply migrate to the United States without restriction. That's
why the Americans limited the immigration to the Dominican Republic.
Okay, there you go.
Because Trujillo had invited up to 100,000 Jews after the Evian conference had basically closed all the doors again. And ultimately it was under 1,000 that the Americans let in. So it's exactly for that reason.
That's interesting.
Alexandra Garberini is asking, what happened in Portugal to Jewish refugees' sense of their own national identity, and how national identity intersected with their class identities?
That's a really good question. Hello, Alexandra. These are some friends that are watching, I guess. I would want to say that what happens in Portugal, they do not develop a Portuguese identity. Many of the younger ones develop pidgin Portuguese. They learn the language, but there's really no Portuguese identity, including those who wind up staying 5 or 6 years because they can't get out, but they want to get out. So it's really, they're transitory. They're sojourners, but they're not planning on staying. So there's not much of a Portuguese identity. Class is a big deal. And I write a lot about that, about the loss of class identity, how especially men, but men and women, painfully understand that they are no longer who they were. Hannah Arendt writes about a man she sees in an aid organization who is very frustrated. He's been waiting for some aid and he just starts to shout. He says, "No one here knows who I am." And they didn't, because he was maybe he was Dr. So-and-so, maybe he was Professor so-and-so, or he was Mr. Businessman in Berlin. And now he's wearing shabby clothing and he's asking for a sweater for winter. So there was tremendous, I wouldn't want to say proletarianization, but a drop in class, definite drop in class. And there were people who lived in barracks in the forced residences, crowded barracks. There were people who were hungry. So that these are middle-class people who kind of expected the accoutrements of middle-class life for the rest of their lives. And suddenly they were dumped into a refugee situation where there was no possibility of maintaining a life that they had imagined. So I think class was really a big issue. They also noticed Portuguese class. They noticed what wealthy Portuguese people, how they dressed, how they went out on the streets, how their daughters were never alone. And then they noticed the poorer Portuguese, and even the poorer Portuguese didn't like the way Jewish women sat in cafes. They really found that appalling because Portuguese women didn't sit in cafes, except if you were possibly a prostitute, but you didn't sit in cafes. But these Jewish women sat in cafes, they were smoking, they wore short sleeves. It was hot, but it was not something known to the class society, the middle-class society in Portugal. So the refugees did notice a lot of differences that way as well. So class and culture.
I'd like to give the panelists an opportunity to say whatever you want to say, if anything.
Well, I would add one other thing, which is that seeing videos today of children at the Mexican border or in Texas, and having heard not just David, but many other people describing how badly children were treated, how they were separated from their parents at the border. All of these contemporary issues had an emotional resonance in me. And so it's almost as if also when the question came up about the history of emotions, sure, I was very interested intellectually in that perspective, but I'm sure you all remember the little boy, the little 2-year-old or 1-year-old on the beach in Turkey, kind of in a child's pose, but dead. I mean, those were heartbreaking. So I think the emotional aspect of refugee life is very important, whether it's historical or whether it's contemporary. So that's all I'd want to say.
Deborah, you want?
I was going to talk about something just a little bit different. I wanted to pick up on what Alon had said about language, just to leave us with the idea that all of us deal with historical information in translation. All of us are dealing with and what do the words mean? So the most obvious, of course, is bread. That what bread, if we use the word bread now, it doesn't mean the same thing as when refugees talked about bread. Bread had many layers of meaning attached to it. And it may have been, Marion, when you were talking about the fruit, which the Portuguese who were poor themselves offered to the incoming migrants, that I don't know, but maybe the words for those fruits came to accrue a different meaning as well. I just wanted to open up this linguistic question.
Thank you.
I'll just to add to Marion's last point about the children along the US-Mexico border and in the Mediterranean and in all these places, and compare it to the reception that happened in Portugal on the ground by the regular people, which, I mean, they clearly saw, whether for religious reasons or neighborly reasons, the humanity of these refugees, you know, and I think it's the opposite for, you know, the leaders today, and obviously the German right, you know, they didn't see humanity, they didn't see human beings, and it's stark, it could be sadistic, and I think that's what's happening with this administration, that is in the United States, and in other administrations in the past, and so it's really about, and there's all kinds of mechanisms and hoops you have to jump through to take away someone's humanity, whether it be linguistic or you blame their own parents, or, you know, there's all kinds of moves you can make, but everyone's making those moves. So when you see that child under the t-shirt of its parent washed ashore, you don't see it. You just don't see what the people in Lisbon saw when they saw someone poor in need. And I think that's just the difference, is that recognition of humanity.
Any more closing thoughts?
I've just learned so much from your comments. I am so grateful to all of you, and also to the questioners. I think those were really helpful as well to keep thinking about. So thank you.
I'd like to thank Marion, our panelist. I thought it was great talks and great discussion, great question. Thank you to everybody. It was a treat. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.